Masters in Psychology, Indira Gandhi National Open University, MPC 1, Cognitive Psychology. We will be doing Unit 4 of Block 1, that is Information Processing, Models of Information Processing. In this Models of Information Processing, we will have Vaughan and Norman's model of primary and secondary memory, Atkinson and Shiffrin's the stage model, level of recall, levels of processing by Craig and Lockhart, self-reference effect, and a connectionist model of memory by Reinhardt and Mackland. Vaughan and Norman's model of primary and secondary memory. Vaughan and Norman theory is dualistic. Primary memory, a short-term storage system, is conceptualized as being independent of secondary memory, a long-term storage system. So secondary memory is a long-term storage system, and this primary memory enters into secondary memory after a lot of rehearsal. A few things are forgotten out of that. Vaughan and Norman borrowed freely from William James' dichotomy of primary and secondary memory and illustrated their theory by means of the model shown in figure below, which encouraged the memory metaphor of boxes in the head that soon proliferated in the literature of cognitive psychology. What Vaughan and Norman did that James never attempted was to quantify properties of primary memory. This short-term storage system was taken to have very limited capacity, so that loss of information from it was postulated to occur not as a simple function of time, but by displacement of old items by new ones. PM could be conceptualized as a storage compartment, much like a vertical file in which information is stored in a slot, or if all the slots are filled, displaces an item occupying one of the slots. Vaughan and Norman traced the fate of items in PM primary memory by using lists of 16 digits that were read to subjects at the rate of 1 digit per second or 4 digits per second. The purpose of presenting digits every second or quarter second was to determine whether forgetting was a function of decay or interference in the PM. If forgetting was a function of decay, then less recall could be expected with the slower rate. If forgetting was a function of interference in PM, then no difference in recall could be expected according to the presentation rate. The same amount of information is presented as both presentation rates, which by Vaughan and Norman's logic allows the same time for decay to occur. It might be argued that even at one item per second, systems would allow extra experimental information to enter their PM. But later experimentation in which presentation rates varied from 1 to 10 digits yielded data consistent with a rate of forgetting expected from the original model. The rate of forgetting for the two presentation rates is similar. Interference seems to be greater factor than decay in forgetting in PM. Vaughan and Norman system makes good sense. PM holds verbal information and is available for verbatim recall. This is true in our ordinary conversation. We can recall that last part of a sentence we have just heard with complete accuracy, even if we were barely paying attention to what was said. However, to recall the same information sometime later is impossible unless we rehearse it, which makes it available through SM. Atkinson and Shiffrin's the stage model. Traditionally, the most widely used model of information processing is the stage theory model. Based on the work of Atkinson and Shiffrin, the stage theory model, as shown in figure, recognizes three types of stages of memory: sensory memory, short-term or working memory, and long-term memory. So this is the long-term memory, short-term memory, which is giving response later on. So the external stimulus, which changes into sensory memory, some changes into forgotten, and then few changes into short-term memory, and this short-term memory after some interval changes into long-term memory. So with a lot of repetition, the short-term memory can again be retrieved and formed into a long-term memory. In the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, memory starts with the sensory input from the environment. This input is held for a very brief time, several seconds at most. In a sensory register associated with the sensory channels, vision, hearing, touch, and so forth, this occurs in as little as half second for visual stimuli and about 4 or 5 seconds for auditory stimuli. The transfer of new information quickly to the next stage of processing is of critical importance, and sensory memory acts as a portal for all information that is to become part of memory. There are many ways to ensure transfer and many methods for facilitating that transfer. To this end, attention and automaticity are the two major influences on sensory memory, and much work has been done to understand the impact of each on information processing. Information that is attended to and recognized in the sensory register may be passed on to second stage of information processing, that is short-term memory or working memory, where it is held for perhaps 20 or 30 seconds. This stage is often viewed as active or conscious memory because it is the part of memory that is being actively processed while new information is being taken in. Some of the information reaching short-term memory is processed by being rehearsed, that is, by having attention focused on it, perhaps by being repeated over and over, or perhaps by being processed in some other way that will link it up with other information already stored in memory. Generally, 5 plus 2 number of units can be processed at any given time in STM. Information that is rehearsed may then be passed along to long-term memory. Information not so processed is lost. When items of information are placed in long-term memory, they are organized into categories, where they may reside for days, months, years, or for a lifetime. When you remember something, a representation of the item is withdrawn or retrieved from long-term memory. Organization of long-term memory. Each of the memory unit or structure represented in the mind is distinct and serves a different operational function. However, it is evident that some type of very specialized categorization system exists within the human mind. One of the first to make this idea explicit was Brunner, as cited in Anderson, 1998. Based upon the idea of categorization, Brunner's theory states to perceive is to categorize. To conceptualize is to categorize. To learn is to form categories. To make decisions is to categorize. Tulving was the first to distinguish between episodic and semantic memory. Episodic memories are those which give a subject the sense of remembering the actual situation or event. Episodic memory store is centered on personal experience and specific events. It is entirely circumstantial and it is not generally used for the processing of new information except as sort of backdrop. Semantic memory, in contrast, deals with general abstract information and can be recalled independently of how it was learned. It is semantic memory that is the central focus of most current study because it houses the concepts, strategies, and other structures that are typically used for encoding new information. Most researchers now combine these two in a broader category labeled declarative. Other researchers have identified additional organizational types. For example, Abbott lists declarative and procedural, while Hewitt, citing the work of Pavio, adds imagery to this list. However, Pileshine states that imagery is not a distinct organizational structure, but follows the rules that apply to semantic and episodemic memory. Abbott and Hewitt define declarative memory as that which can be talked about or verbalized. It is then the sum of stored information that can be readily retrieved and put into words in conscious thought and sharing. As previously stated, declarative memory can be subdivided into both semantic and episodemic memories. Procedural memory can be thought of as how-to knowledge. It is the type of long-term memory sometimes associated with information that has reached a state of automaticity, but it not limited to this. This type of memory is defined in terms of learned skills and the ability to recall instruction like memory. Pavio describes imagery as the memory structure for collecting and storing information related to pictures. It captures information much like a photograph and can be extremely useful for context and visual presentation of information. Information processing in three-stage model, Atkinson and Shiffrin, make an important distinction between the concepts of memory and memory stores. They use the term memory to refer to the data being retained, while store refers to the structural component that contains the information, simply indicating how long an item has been retained does not necessarily reveal where it is located in the structure of memory. Information processing from one store to another is largely controlled by the subject. Information briefly held in the sensory register is scanned by the subject and selected information is introduced into the STS. Transfer of information from the STS was regarded as capable of taking place so long as it was held there. Atkinson and Shiffrin postulated that information might enter the long-term store directly from the sensory register. Level of recall. In a report by P.I. Zinchenko, a Russian psychologist, the matter of how a subject interacts with the material to be learned and committed to memory was introduced. The basic notion was that words encoded by deep means would be retained in incidental memory better than if encoded by other superficial means. Thus, the memory of words was profoundly influenced by the goal of the subject at the time the material was presented. Different goals were thought to activate different systems of connections because subjects have different orientation toward the material. The thesis was tested in an experiment in which subjects were given 10 series of 4 words. The first word was to be connected to one of the other words, but the instructions varied for each of 3 words. An example of a series is house, window, building, fish. In the first condition, the subjects were asked to identify the word whose meaning was different from the first word, house or fish. In a second condition, subjects were asked to make a concrete connection between the first word and one of the other words, house or window. In the third condition, the subjects were asked to make a logical connection between the first word and one of the other 3 words. Zinchenko thought that by altering the instruction, the subjects would not only have different goals toward the material, but also be required to examine each item for meaning. After a brief interrupting task, the subjects were asked to recall the items. In the condition in which subjects form logical connection between the first word and another word, recall of the target word occurred with greater fluency than the other condition. Recall of the concrete relationship words was greater than the no meaning condition. Thus, the level of recall, as Zinchenko called it, is determined by the goal of an action. In the experiment cited, we can see that when subjects were given a learning set or instruction to process material at different levels, recall of the material was affected greatly because the original paper was published in Russian and not widely distributed. It has not been incorporated into the larger framework of memory models. Nevertheless, as we shall see, the experiment presented by Zinchenko, because of its theoretical importance to the concept of levels of processing, which has had a profound influence on cognitive psychology, has important consequences for our conceptualization of human memory. Levels of processing, Craig and Lockhart. Craig and Lockhart's levels of processing model as a reaction against the boxes in the head scheme of memory is consistent with that view. They take the position that data can be better described by a concept of memory based on levels of processing. The general idea is that incoming stimuli are subjected to a series of analysis starting with shallow sensory analysis and proceeding to deeper, more complex abstract and semantic analysis. Whether a stimulus is processed at a shallow or deep stage depends on the nature of the stimulus and the time available for processing. An item processed at a deep level is less likely to be forgotten than one processed at a shallow level. At the earliest level, incoming stimuli are subjected to sensory and featural analysis. At a deeper level, the item may be recognized by means of pattern recognition and extraction of meaning. At a still deeper level, it may engage the subject's long-term association. With deeper processing, greater degree of semantic or cognitive analysis is undertaken. Consider word recognition. For example, at the preliminary stages, the visual configuration may be analyzed according to such physical or sensory features as lines and angles. Later stages are concerned with matching the stimuli with stored information. For example, recognition that one of the letters corresponds to the pattern identified as A. At the highest level, the recognized pattern may trigger association, images, or stories on the basis of the subject's past experience with the word. The significant use. In Craig and Lockhart's view is that we are capable of perceiving at meaningful levels before we analyze information at a more primitive level. Thus, levels of processing are more a spread of processing, with highly familiar, meaningful stimuli more likely to be processed at a deeper level than less meaningful stimuli. That we can perceive at a deeper level before analyzing at a shallow level cast grave doubts on original levels of processing formulation. Perhaps we are dealing simply with different types of processing, with the types not following any constant sequence. If all types are equally accessible to the incoming stimulus, then the notion of levels could be replaced by a system that drops the notion of levels or depth but retains some Craig and Lockhart's ideas about rehearsal and about the formation of memory traces. A model that is closer to their original idea is shown in the figure. This figure depicts the memory activation involved in proof reading a passage as contrasted with that involved in reading the same passage for the gist of the material. Proofreading, that is looking at the surface of the passage, involves elaborate, shallow processing and minimal semantic processing. Reading for gist, that is trying to get the essential points, involves minimal shallow processing or maintenance rehearsal held in memory without elaboration but elaborate semantic processing. Another example of this latter kind of memory activity would be a typist who concentrates on responding to letter sequences but has very little understanding of the material being typed. As a result of some studies, Craig and Watkins and Lockhart, Craig and Jacobi, the idea that stimuli are always processed through an unwavering sequence of stages was abandoned, while the general principle that some sensory processing must precede semantic analysis was retained. Levels of processing versus information processing. Information processing models of memory have generally stressed structural components. For example, sensory store, short-term memory and long-term memory, dealing with processing, for example, attention, coding, rehearsal, transformation of information and forgetting as operation that are tied, sometimes uniquely to the structural components. However, another approach is to postulate, process, and then to formulate a memory system. In terms of these operations, Craig and Lockhart have taken just such a position, and their implicit criticism of the information processing model suggests that it is failing on hard times. Where information processing models of memory stress the sequence of stages through which information is moved and processed, this alternative viewpoint argues that memory traces are formed as a byproduct of perceptual processing. Thus, the durability of memory is conceptualized as a function of the depth of processing. Information that is not given full attention and is analyzed onto a shallow level is soon forgotten. Information that is deeply processed, attended to, fully analyzed, and enriched by associations or images is long lasting. The levels of processing model is not free of criticism. The criticism includes that it seems to say like little more than that meaningful events are well remembered, a mundane conclusion. It is vague and generally untestable, and it is circular in that any events that are well remembered are designated, deeply processed with no objective and independent index of depth available. So here, proofreading, the gist idea, and elaborate rehearsal, memory activation in two kinds of reading. So when you are reading for just a gist of that, and when you are doing the proofreading. One clear difference between the boxes in the head theory, Wog, Norman, and Atkinson and Schifrin, and the levels of processing theory, Craig and Lockhart, is their respective notions concerning rehearsal. In the former, rehearsal or repetition of information in STAM serves the function of transferring it to a longer lasting memory store. In the latter, rehearsal is conceptualized as either maintaining information at one level of analysis or elaborating information by processing it to a deeper level. The first type, maintenance rehearsal, will not lead to better retention. Craig and Tulvig tested the idea that words that are deeply processed should be recalled better than those that are less so. They did this by having subjects simply rate words as to their structural, phonemic, or semantic aspects. Craig and Tulving measured both the time to make a decision and recognition of the rated words. The data obtained are interpreted as showing that deeper processing takes longer to accomplish, and recognition of encoded words increases as a function of the level to which they are processed, with those words engaging semantic aspects better recognized than those engaging only the phonological or structural aspects. Usually slightly different task, uh, D. Agostino, O'Neill, and Pavio Klein, and Salton and Scullman obtained similar results. Self-reference effect. New light was shed on the levels of a processing concept when Rogers, Cooper, and Kierkegaard showed that self-reference is a powerful method variable. Using a method similar to that of Craig and Tulving, they asked subjects to evaluate a list of 40 adjectives on one of 4 tasks hypothesized to vary in depth or semantic richness. Included were structural, phonemic, semantic, and self-reference tasks. As in the Craig and Tulving study, it was assumed that words more deeply coded during rating should be recalled better than those words with shallow coding. After the subjects rated the words, they were asked to free recall as many of the words they had rated as possible. Recall was poorest for words rated structurally and ascended through those phonemically rated and semantically rated. Self-reference words were recalled best. The narcissistic trait modification of the original experiment have been conducted in several laboratories, with the results being about the same. Some have argued that self-reference tasks are stored in some spatial memory system. Certainly, if you are asked to evaluate a personality trait as being self-descriptive, such as greedy, loving, or angry, you are engaging a very powerful self-schema, an organized system of internal attributes that is constellated around the topic of I, me, my. We also call this the narcissistic trait. Since we all know a great deal about ourselves and are emotionally, if not intellectually, deeply invested in ourselves, we have a rich and elaborate internal network available for storing self-information. Because of these complex internal self-structures, we can more easily organize new information as it might refer to ourselves than other, more mundane information. Whether or not these self-rating memories are stored in different parts of the brain remains a question, but it is a good hunch that plenty of precious brain space is given over to the narcissistic trait. A connectionist parallel distributed processing model of memory, Rimmelhart and Mackland. These PDP models assume that information processing takes place through the interactions of a large number of simple processing elements called units, each sending excitatory and inhibitory signals to other units. These units may stand for possible guesses about letters in a string of words or notes on a score. In other situations, the units may stand for possible goals and actions, such as reading a particular letter or playing a specific note. Proponents suggest that PDP models are concerned with the description of the internal structure of larger units of cognitive activity, such as reading, perceiving, processing sentences, and so on. The connectionist model attempts to describe memory from the even finer grained analysis of processing units, which resemble neurons. Furthermore, the connectionist model is based on the development of laws that govern the representation of knowledge in memory. One additional feature of the PDP model of memory is that it is not just a model of memory, it is also a model for action and the representation of knowledge. A fundamental assumption of the PDP model is that mental processes take place through a system of highly interconnected units, which take on activation values and communicate with other units. Units are simple processing elements that stand for possible hypotheses about the nature of things, such as letters in a display, the rules that govern syntax, and goals or actions. Units can be compared to atoms in that both are building blocks for more complete structures and combine with others of their kind to form larger networks. A neuron in the brain is a type of unit that combines with other neurons in a parallel processing mode to form larger systems. Units are organized into modules much as atoms are organized into molecules. The number of units per module range from thousands to millions. Each unit receives information from other module and after processing passes information to other modules. In this model, information is received, is permeated throughout the model and leaves traces behind when it has passed through. These traces change in the strength of the connection between individual units in the model. A memory trace, such as a friend's name, may be distributed over many different connections. The storage of information, for example, friend's name, is thought to be content addressable. That is, we can access the information in memory on the basis of its attributes. You can recall your friend's name if I show you a picture of him, tell you where he lives, or describe what he does. All of these attributes may be used to access the name in memory. Of course, some cues are better than others. Even though the theory is abstract, it touches real life activities. To continue with the example of your friend's name, suppose I ask, what is the name of the man you played tennis with? Such an inquiry gives at least two content addressable cues, man and tennis player. If you play tennis with only one man and you know his name, then the answer could be easy. If you have many partners who are men, then the answer may be impossible. Additional information. For example, the man with the beard, the left-handed player, the guy with red tennis shorts, the dude with the rocket-like serve, the chap with the Boston Terrier, and so forth may easily focus the search. You can imagine how very narrow the search would be if all of those attributes were associated with only one person. The man who you play tennis with has a beard, is left-handed, wears red tennis shorts, has a hot serve, and has a terrier. In real life, each of these attributes may be associated with more than one person. You may know several people who have a hot serve or have a beard. If that is the case, it is possible to recall names other than the intended one. However, if the categories are specific and mutually exclusive, retrieval is likely to be accurate. How can a PDP modular concept of memory keep these interfering components from running into each other? According to this model, information is represented in memory in terms of numerous connections with other units. If an attribute is part of a number of different memories and is activated, then it will tend to excite all the memories in which attribute is a part. One way interfering components are kept from overrunning the system is to conceptualize the relationship between units as being subject to inhibitory laws. Thus, when we identify the person you play tennis with as a man, in theory, we inhibit all searches for people who are women. When we add that he has a Boston Terrier, then we do not search for the names of people with whom you do not play tennis and who do not own a Boston Terrier. Consider the following example of prototype learning suggested by Macklin and Rummelhard. A small boy sees many different dogs, each only once and each with a different name. All the dogs have slightly different features but can be considered a variation of prototype dog, the epitome of dogness. The boy forms a memory for a prototypical dog on the basis of experience with exemplar dogs. As in the case of faces, the boy is likely to recognize the prototype dog as a dog even if he has never seen it. Of course, the boy is not likely to. Information processing remember the names of each of individual dogs, though the most recently seen dog may still be in memory. The rationale offered by the connectionist model for prototype formation in the case of the boy and his dog is that each time the boy sees a dog, a visual pattern of activation is produced over several of the units in the module. In contrast, the name of the dog produces a reduced pattern of activation. The combined activation of all exemplar dogs sums to the prototype dog, which may be the stable memory representation. Thus, the model more detailed than presented here seems to account for this form of memory quite nicely. The connectionist model of memory has won many disciples in the past few years. Its popularity is due in part to its elegant mathematical models, its relationship to neural networks, and its flexibility in accounting for diverse form of memories. Unit 10 questions. Describe the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of information processing in detail. Compare information processing and level of processing models of memory. How does a connectionist model handle memory? What is meant by level of recall, level of processing, and self-reference effect? What are the basic principles and models of information processing? How does organization in long-term memory take place? Design an experiment to compare the maintenance and elaborate level of information processing. Thank you. This is the end of block 1, information processing.